Welcome back to the channel. Tonight we step quietly into the past, into a world far removed from comfort and convenience. Today we drift into the harsh and unsettling reality of life on the American frontier, where survival came before cleanliness, and every day meant facing conditions few could imagine. As we explore the hidden, gritty details of frontier living, let your mind slow down and settle into the story. And if you enjoy immersive history like this, don't forget to subscribe and join us for more journeys into the forgotten corners of the past. Life on the American frontier was harsh, unforgiving, and often filthy, a reality that stood in stark contrast to the romanticized vision of endless opportunity and heroic pioneers that later generations would come to celebrate. For the people who actually lived it, the frontier was not a grand adventure but a daily struggle against dirt, disease, hunger, and exhaustion. Every task required physical labor, every comfort was earned with effort, and every day brought the possibility of illness or injury. The environment itself seemed determined to test the limits of human endurance. Wind carried dust into homes and lungs, rain turned pathways into mud, and heat encouraged the rapid spread of decay. There were no modern sanitation systems, no reliable medical care, and no easy access to clean water. Survival depended on improvisation, resilience, and the willingness to accept conditions that today would be considered unbearable. Settlers quickly learned that the promise of land and independence came with a hidden cost, a life surrounded by grime and uncertainty. Even basic necessities were difficult to maintain. Clothing became stiff with sweat and dirt, hands remained calloused and stained, and the air inside homes often smelled of smoke and damp wood. The frontier demanded constant work, leaving little time or energy for cleanliness. Every hour spent washing or scrubbing was an hour not spent gathering firewood, planting crops, repairing tools, or hunting food. As a result, hygiene became a secondary concern, not because people lacked awareness but because survival took precedence over comfort. Water, one of the most essential elements of life, was also one of the most dangerous. Streams and rivers that appeared clear often hid invisible threats. Animals drank from the same sources, waded through them, and left waste along their banks. Upstream, another family might wash clothes, clean tools, or dispose of refuse. Rainstorms washed soil, manure, and debris into the flow, turning it into a mixture that carried bacteria and parasites. Yet settlers depended on these sources for drinking, cooking, and cleaning. Many had no choice but to fill buckets and hope for the best. Boiling water could reduce some dangers, but doing so required fuel, and fuel required time and labor. Firewood had to be cut, hauled, stacked, and dried. In harsh winters or during long dry spells, wood became precious. Families often saved it for cooking and heating, leaving little for boiling large quantities of water. As a result, many drank it untreated, accepting the risk as part of daily life. Illness spread easily under these conditions. Dysentery caused severe dehydration, cholera could sweep through communities rapidly, and typhoid fever lingered for weeks. Symptoms ranged from cramps and fever to extreme weakness, and recovery was uncertain. Without proper treatment, even a strong adult could be reduced to helplessness. When one person fell ill, the entire household felt the impact. Work stopped, crops went untended, and resources dwindled. Children were especially vulnerable, their smaller bodies less able to withstand prolonged sickness. Entire settlements sometimes experienced waves of illness, each family coping in isolation, unsure whether help would arrive. The contamination of water sources was only one part of the problem. Storage methods also contributed to risk. Water was often kept in wooden barrels or metal containers that were rarely sanitized. Dust settled inside, insects crawled along the rim, and hands dipped in repeatedly throughout the day. Over time, even relatively clean water became questionable. Still, people drank it, cooked with it, and used it to mix medicines, trusting necessity over caution. The act of fetching water itself was laborious. Wells were not always available, and many families relied on distant streams. Someone had to carry heavy buckets back to the cabin, sometimes walking long distances over uneven ground. In winter, ice had to be broken first. In summer, heat made the journey exhausting. Because of the effort involved, water was rationed carefully. It was used sparingly, and activities like bathing were postponed or skipped entirely. Drinking and cooking took priority, leaving little for washing. Even when families attempted to maintain cleanliness, the process was imperfect. A single basin might serve multiple purposes: washing hands, cleaning vegetables, and wiping down surfaces. Each use added more contaminants. Towels were reused, rarely dried completely, and often hung near smoky fires. Over time, these practices created an environment where germs could thrive. Yet settlers adapted, accepting discomfort as normal. The constant presence of dirt became part of life. Boots tracked mud indoors and floors were swept only when time allowed. Dust settled quickly, especially in dry regions, coating furniture and bedding. Mattresses were stuffed with straw or corn husks, which attracted insects and absorbed moisture. When they became too worn or infested, they were emptied and refilled, a task that stirred up more dust. Even the air carried challenges. Smoke from cooking fires lingered indoors, irritating eyes and lungs. Chimneys were crude and ventilation was limited. On cold nights, doors and windows remained closed, trapping heat and smoke together. Over time, walls darkened with soot, and breathing became difficult. Yet the fire was essential. It provided warmth, cooked food, and dried damp clothing. Without it, survival in winter would be impossible. Settlers tolerated the irritation, knowing the alternative was worse. Cooking itself contributed to the unsanitary environment. Food preparation surfaces were simple wooden tables, often scarred and porous. Meat juices soaked into the grain, and cleaning consisted of wiping with a cloth. Soap was scarce and usually homemade from animal fat and lye. While effective to some degree, it was not always available in sufficient quantities. Utensils were rinsed in the same water used for multiple tasks, and drying often meant hanging them near the fire. Flies were constant companions, especially in warmer months. They landed on food, waste, and animals, carrying bacteria from one place to another. Keeping them away required effort, but screens and sealed containers were rare. Meals were eaten quickly, sometimes outdoors, but even there insects gathered. Leftovers were difficult to store safely, and spoilage was common. The climate influenced conditions as well. In humid regions, moisture encouraged mold and mildew. Clothing hung to dry remained damp, and walls absorbed water. In dry regions, dust replaced moisture as the primary nuisance. Windstorms filled cabins with fine particles that settled everywhere. Either way, maintaining cleanliness required constant attention that few could afford. Daily routines left little room for extra tasks. From sunrise to sunset, settlers worked fields, repaired fences, gathered fuel, and cared for animals. Exhaustion set in quickly, and evenings were spent preparing for the next day. Cleaning became occasional rather than routine. Over time, habits formed around necessity rather than preference. People grew accustomed to the smell of smoke, the feel of rough fabric, and the sight of dirt under their nails. What might seem unbearable to modern observers was simply life as they knew it. Despite these hardships, communities developed resilience. Neighbors sometimes shared resources, including clear water sources or spare soap. During outbreaks of illness, families checked on one another, offering food or assistance. However, distances between homesteads limited frequent contact. Isolation meant that many struggles were faced alone. The frontier demanded independence, but it also exposed individuals to risk. When storms flooded streams or drought reduced water levels, conditions worsened. Muddy water became the only option, and rationing grew stricter. Livestock competed for the same sources, adding further contamination. Settlers often improvised, digging shallow wells or collecting rainwater. These solutions helped but were not always reliable. Rain barrels attracted debris, and shallow wells could draw from polluted ground. Still, any alternative was welcomed. Over time, some families improved their circumstances. They built deeper wells, lined them with stone, and constructed better storage containers. Yet such improvements required time, tools, and stability, luxuries not immediately available. For new arrivals, the first months were the hardest. They confronted the raw reality of frontier life with limited supplies and experience. Many learned through trial and error, adapting methods to reduce risk. Others suffered repeated illness before finding safer practices. The learning curve was steep, and the consequences of mistakes were severe. Even small children participated in daily tasks. They carried smaller buckets, gathered kindling, and helped with chores. In doing so, they were exposed to the same unsanitary conditions as adults. Cuts and scrapes were common, and without proper cleaning, infections developed. Parents did their best, using herbal remedies or simple bandages, but success varied. Life continued regardless, driven by necessity. The frontier did not allow pause. Crops needed planting, animals required feeding, and shelters demanded maintenance. Cleanliness remained secondary to survival. Over months and years, settlers adapted psychologically as well as physically. They lowered expectations, accepting that perfection was impossible. A relatively tidy cabin was considered an achievement, even if it still contained dust and smoke. A clear stream after heavy rain seemed like a blessing. Small improvements brought relief, and perseverance became a defining trait. The myth of the frontier often highlights courage and independence, but beneath those qualities lay endurance in the face of constant discomfort. The filth was not simply a matter of neglect, it was the unavoidable byproduct of a life lived without modern infrastructure. Every improvement required labor, and labor was always in short supply. People chose survival first, comfort second. The result was a world where dirt and determination existed side by side, shaping the daily experience of those who ventured into the unknown. Bathing was another luxury few could afford on the American frontier, not because people lacked concern for cleanliness, but because every drop of water and every minute of time had to be carefully managed. Washing the body required far more than simply stepping into a tub. Water had to be collected, often from a distant stream or shallow well, carried back in heavy buckets, poured into a large pot, and heated over a fire that itself required chopped wood. Each step demanded effort. A full bath for one person could consume gallons of water and a significant portion of the day's fuel supply. For families struggling to cook meals and stay warm, dedicating such resources to bathing seemed impractical. As a result, many settlers settled for partial washing, wiping hands and faces when possible, and postponing full baths until circumstances allowed. Weeks sometimes passed between thorough cleanings. In colder months, bathing became even more difficult. Water froze in buckets, and heating large quantities meant burning precious firewood needed for survival. Removing clothing in a drafty cabin during winter carried its own risks, exposing the body to cold that could lead to illness. People chose to remain clothed, layering garments for warmth even as those layers accumulated sweat and grime. The smell of unwashed fabric became a constant companion, but it was tolerated because warmth mattered more. Even in warmer seasons, time constraints limited hygiene. Dawn brought a long list of chores: tending animals, preparing food, working fields, repairing tools, and gathering supplies. By the time evening arrived, exhaustion overshadowed the desire to wash. Settlers often prioritized rest, knowing the next day would demand equal effort. When bathing did occur, it was rarely a private or luxurious experience. A single wooden tub might be brought indoors, filled partially with heated water, and shared among family members. Typically, the youngest children bathed first, followed by older siblings, and finally the adults. With each use, the water grew murkier. Dirt from one person transferred to the next, reducing the effectiveness of washing. By the end, the water was thick and cloudy, yet still used because replacing it required too much effort. Soap was another challenge. While some families produced homemade soap from animal fat and lye, the process was time-consuming and not always successful. Poorly made soap could irritate the skin or fail to clean effectively. Store-bought soap was rare and expensive, reserved for special occasions. Without sufficient soap, washing relied heavily on water alone, which did little to remove oils and accumulated grime. Scrubbing cloths were reused repeatedly, sometimes hanging near the fire to dry, absorbing smoke and dust in the process. Towels were scarce, and families often shared them. Damp fabric, used multiple times, became a breeding ground for bacteria. Clothing presented an even greater challenge. Frontier garments were made from durable materials like wool, cotton, and linen, designed to withstand heavy labor. These fabrics absorbed sweat and dirt, becoming stiff over time. Washing clothes required large amounts of water and vigorous scrubbing, usually done outdoors. Women often spent hours at a washboard, rubbing fabric against ridged surfaces to loosen grime. This work was physically demanding, especially in cold weather when hands became numb. After washing, clothes were wrung out and hung to dry, sometimes taking days in humid conditions. Because of the effort involved, laundry was done infrequently. Many settlers owned only a few sets of clothing, wearing the same garments repeatedly until washing became unavoidable. Underclothing, in particular, was rarely changed. The buildup of sweat created an environment where lice and other parasites thrived. Lice eggs clung to seams and collars, spreading easily among family members. Fleas jumped from bedding to clothing, and mites irritated the skin. Scratching became common, sometimes leading to sores that could become infected. People attempted to manage infestations by boiling clothing or hanging it near the fire, but these methods were not always effective. Bedding itself contributed to the problem. Mattresses filled with straw or feathers absorbed sweat and dirt. They were rarely cleaned, and over time they harbored insects. Families occasionally emptied them and replaced the filling, but this stirred up dust and parasites. Blankets, often made of wool, were heavy and difficult to wash. They were aired outdoors when weather allowed, but deep cleaning was rare. At night, unwashed bodies and clothing transferred grime to bedding, continuing the cycle. Hair care was minimal. Washing hair required additional water and time, so it was done infrequently. Grease and dust accumulated, and combs were used to remove tangles. Lice often lived in hair, particularly among children. Some settlers cut hair short to reduce maintenance, while others covered it with hats or scarves. These coverings protected from sun and cold but also trapped sweat, adding to discomfort. Shaving was irregular as well. Men often grew beards, partly for warmth, and partly because daily shaving required water and sharp tools. Razors dulled quickly and needed careful maintenance. Without proper sanitation, small cuts from shaving could become infected. As a result, many avoided shaving unless necessary. Even hands and faces, the most visible parts of the body, were not always clean. Water used for quick washing might be reused throughout the day. A basin near the door served multiple purposes, and the water inside gradually darkened. Children returning from outdoor play dipped their hands, followed by adults before meals. While this offered some improvement, it was far from hygienic by modern standards. Nail care was limited, and dirt collected beneath nails, especially for those working with soil and animals. The environment outside reinforced these conditions. Dust clung to skin during dry weather, while mud coated boots and clothing during rain. Wind carried particles that settled on exposed surfaces. After a day of labor, bodies were coated with a mixture of sweat, soil, and plant matter. Removing it completely required resources few possessed. Instead, settlers brushed off what they could and continued with daily routines. Seasonal changes influenced hygiene habits. During summer, increased sweating made washing more desirable, but water sources sometimes shrank, concentrating contaminants. Insects multiplied, adding to discomfort. In winter, reduced sweating made infrequent bathing seem acceptable, but heavy clothing trapped odors. Each season presented different challenges, none easily solved. Social norms adapted to these realities. Visitors expected modest cleanliness but did not anticipate perfection. A tidy appearance meant clothing free of obvious mud and hair combed, even if underlying hygiene was limited. People judged one another less harshly because everyone faced similar conditions. Occasional gatherings offered opportunities for improved grooming. Before church services or community events, families might make extra effort to wash and change clothing. These moments stood out, providing a temporary sense of freshness. However, such occasions were rare. Daily life quickly returned to routine. Children learned these habits early. They assisted with laundry, fetched water, and accepted infrequent bathing as normal. Their play often involved dirt and animals, adding to exposure. Parents balanced the desire for cleanliness with practical limitations. Minor illnesses resulting from poor hygiene were common, but they were viewed as part of life. Over time, settlers developed strategies to cope. Some used sand or ash to scrub hands when soap was unavailable. Others added herbs to bathwater for fragrance. These methods offered modest improvement but did not eliminate underlying challenges. The absence of plumbing meant that every improvement required manual effort. There were no pipes delivering heated water, no drains carrying waste away, and no machines simplifying tasks. Everything depended on human labor. This reliance shaped priorities. When time was scarce, essential survival tasks came first. Hygiene remained important but secondary. Despite these hardships, people valued cleanliness within their means. A freshly washed face or newly laundered shirt lifted spirits. The smell of clean fabric, though rare, brought comfort. These small moments reminded settlers of better conditions they hoped to achieve. Over years, as communities stabilized, some improvements appeared. Larger homes included separate wash areas, and shared wells provided more reliable water. Yet the early years remained marked by limited bathing and persistent grime. The frontier demanded resilience not only in facing danger but in enduring discomfort. Personal hygiene, constrained by environment and resources, reflected the broader struggle for survival. Cabins themselves offered little relief from the hardships of frontier life, and in many ways they intensified the constant struggle against dirt, smoke, and discomfort. Most structures were built quickly, often by families with limited tools and little formal knowledge of construction. Speed mattered more than precision, because shelter was urgently needed before weather conditions worsened. Logs were cut and stacked, gaps were filled with mud or clay, and roofs were assembled from wooden shingles or even sod. These materials provided basic protection from wind and rain, but they also introduced new challenges. Dirt floors were common. especially in the earliest stages of settlement. While easy to construct, they turned to mud during storms and produced dust during dry periods. Every footstep stirred particles into the air, coating bedding, food, and clothing. Sweeping helped temporarily, but without a solid surface, cleanliness was impossible to maintain. Even when families later added wooden planks, the boards often had gaps that trapped debris. Over time, crumbs, soil, and insects accumulated beneath them, creating hidden pockets of grime. Rainstorms made conditions worse. Water seeped through roofs and walls, especially where mud chinking cracked. Puddles formed indoors, and dampness lingered long after storms passed. Moisture encouraged mold growth, and wooden surfaces absorbed odors. Blankets and clothing hung near the fire to dry, but smoke clung to them, mixing with the smell of wet wood. The air inside cabins became heavy and stale. Ventilation was limited, because openings allowed cold drafts in winter and insects in summer. Windows, if present at all, were small and often covered with oiled paper instead of glass. This reduced airflow and trapped smoke from indoor fires. Fireplaces were essential, yet they were imperfectly designed. Chimneys built from stone or clay sometimes leaked, allowing smoke to drift back into the room. During still weather, smoke accumulated, irritating eyes and throats. Over time, soot coated walls, darkening them and leaving a greasy residue. Touching surfaces left smudges on hands and clothing. Despite these conditions, fires burned constantly. They were needed for cooking, warmth, and light. Families accepted smoky interiors as unavoidable. The smell of wood smoke became part of daily life, clinging to hair, fabric, and even skin. Furniture was minimal and often handmade. Rough tables, benches, and shelves served practical purposes but were difficult to clean. Their uneven surfaces trapped crumbs and dust. Chairs were scarce, and many people sat on stools or directly on bedding. Mattresses filled with straw or corn husks rested on simple frames or even on the floor. Over time, the filling compressed and absorbed moisture, creating an environment for insects. Families periodically replaced the stuffing, but this required time and materials. During replacement, dust filled the air, and parasites scattered temporarily before returning. Storage space was limited. Food, tools, clothing, and household items were kept together in cramped quarters. Without cupboards or sealed containers, supplies were exposed to dust and pests. Rodents often entered cabins through gaps in walls, attracted by food scraps. They nested in corners and gnawed through sacks of grain. Their droppings added to unsanitary conditions. Cats were sometimes kept to control mice, but they introduced their own mess. Animals living inside the cabin was another reality. During cold nights, families brought chickens, pigs, or goats indoors to protect them from predators and freezing temperatures. These animals provided warmth, but they also brought mud, parasites, and droppings. Straw placed on the floor absorbed waste temporarily, but it needed frequent replacement. The smell of livestock mixed with smoke and damp wood, creating a persistent odor. Flies followed animals indoors during warmer months, landing on food and surfaces. Cleaning up after animals required additional effort, and not all families managed it consistently. Cooking took place within the same confined space. Pots hung over the fire, and grease splattered onto nearby surfaces. Without proper ventilation, cooking odors lingered. Food scraps sometimes fell onto the floor, attracting insects and rodents. Washing dishes was done in basins, and wastewater was often thrown just outside the door, where it soaked into the ground. Over time, the area around the cabin became muddy and unpleasant. People tracked this mud back inside, continuing the cycle. Lighting was limited to candles or oil lamps. These produced soot and occasional spills. Wax dripped onto surfaces and oil lamps emitted fumes. Shadows filled corners, making thorough cleaning difficult. Dirt accumulated unnoticed until it became obvious. Even then, removing it required time that was rarely available. Seasonal changes influenced cabin conditions. In summer, heat built up inside, especially in poorly ventilated structures. Sweating increased and odors intensified. Insects entered through every opening, buzzing around food and bedding. In winter, cold air seeped through gaps, forcing families to stay close to the fire. This concentration increased smoke exposure. Wet boots and clothing were placed near flames to dry, releasing moisture and dirt. Spring and autumn brought their own challenges, with rain and mud dominating. Children played outside and returned covered in soil, which they carried indoors. Attempts to maintain order were constant but imperfect. Families swept floors daily when possible, wiped surfaces, and aired bedding. However, the environment quickly undid their efforts. Dust settled again, smoke-coated walls, and animals tracked in dirt. Cleanliness was temporary. Over time, settlers accepted a certain level of disorder as unavoidable. Personal space was limited. Entire families slept in one room, sharing warmth but also sharing odors and germs. Coughs and sneezes spread easily. When someone fell ill, isolation was difficult. The sick rested near the fire, and others continued daily activities around them. Bedding used by the ill was later reused, sometimes without thorough cleaning. Despite these hardships, cabins represented security. They protected against weather and wildlife. Families took pride in improving them gradually. Some added lofts for sleeping, reducing crowding. Others replaced dirt floors with wood or sealed gaps more carefully. These improvements reduced, but did not eliminate, unsanitary conditions. The process of building and maintaining cabins demanded constant labor. Logs shifted over time, requiring adjustments. Roofs leaked and needed patching. Chimneys cracked and had to be repaired. Each repair stirred dust and debris. Tools used for construction were stored indoors, bringing additional dirt. The act of living and maintaining the structure blended together. Surroundings outside the cabin influenced interior conditions. Yards were often muddy, especially near water sources. Livestock moved freely, leaving waste. Without proper drainage, rainwater pooled. Families tried to keep entryways clean, sometimes placing mats or scraping boots, but effectiveness was limited. Wind carried dust inside whenever doors opened. Children and pets moved in and out constantly, reducing control over cleanliness. Even sleeping offered little escape. Nighttime brought cooler air, but also insects. Mosquitoes entered through gaps, buzzing around faces. People covered themselves with blankets, which trapped heat and odors. Dreams were often interrupted by discomfort. Morning revealed the same environment, unchanged. Over years, as communities grew, some cabins evolved into more substantial homes. Yet early structures left lasting impressions. They shaped habits and expectations. Settlers learned to function in spaces that combined living, cooking, sleeping, and animal care. The boundaries between clean and dirty blurred. Practicality replaced comfort. The cabin became both refuge and challenge, offering shelter while surrounding its occupants with constant reminders of the frontier's harsh reality. Food storage posed another challenge on the American frontier, and the absence of refrigeration meant that every meal depended on timing, weather, and careful judgment. Fresh meat spoiled quickly, especially during warm months, and families had to decide whether to cook immediately, preserve it, or risk losing it entirely. Hunting provided game such as deer, rabbit, and wild fowl, but once an animal was killed, the race against decay began. Without ice houses or reliable cooling, settlers relied on salting, smoking, or drying. These methods required preparation and resources. Salt had to be purchased or transported over long distances, making it valuable. Smoking meat demanded a controlled fire and time, while drying depended on favorable weather. If rain or humidity interfered, meat could develop mold before preservation was complete. In lean periods, families sometimes consumed food that had begun to spoil, trimming away obvious rot and cooking the rest thoroughly in hopes of avoiding illness. Hunger often outweighed caution. Vegetables were easier to store but still vulnerable. Root crops like potatoes and turnips could last longer, yet they required cool, dry spaces. Many cabins lacked proper cellars, so produce was kept in baskets or sacks, exposed to fluctuations in temperature. Mold spread easily, and insects burrowed into soft skins. Grain was stored in barrels, but rodents gnawed through wood to reach it. A family might open a container to find their supply contaminated by droppings. Still, they sifted what they could and used it. Knowing waste meant hardship. Bread was baked in batches and eaten over several days. Without preservatives, it hardened quickly, sometimes developing spots of mold. Instead of discarding it, settlers softened stale bread in soups or stews. Leftovers from meals were rarely thrown away. They were combined with new ingredients, creating dishes that masked age and flavor changes. The practice conserved food but also increased the chance of consuming bacteria. Dairy products were particularly difficult. Milk spoiled within hours in warm weather. Butter and cheese offered longer storage but required skill to produce. Even then, they could turn rancid. Families often relied on dried or salted foods as staples, accepting limited variety. Salted pork, for instance, was common. It lasted longer but carried its own problems. The high salt content required soaking before cooking, using precious water. If soaking was rushed, the meat remained overly salty. If done thoroughly, it risked exposure to contaminants. Cooking itself did not always eliminate dangers. Fires varied in intensity, and uneven heat meant some portions of food were undercooked. Pots were reused without thorough cleaning, and residues from previous meals remained. Flies landed on prepared dishes, especially during summer. They moved from waste areas to food surfaces, spreading germs. Covering food was difficult without proper containers. Cloths offered partial protection but absorbed grease and dirt. Storage of cooked food inside cabins attracted pests. Mice climbed shelves and insects crawled across surfaces. Families attempted to suspend food from rafters or place it in boxes, but determined pests often succeeded. Nighttime brought additional risk, as rodents were more active. In the morning, evidence of their presence appeared in scattered crumbs and gnawed edges. Still, settlers consumed what remained, brushing away contamination. Water used in cooking also influenced safety. As previously noted, sources were not always clean. Boiling helped, but if water was only heated slightly, bacteria survived. Soups and stews simmered for long periods, which reduced risk, yet ingredients added late might not receive enough heat. The blending of various leftovers created unpredictable combinations. Some days meals were nourishing, other days they caused discomfort. Waste disposal compounded these issues. Outhouses were typically shallow pits dug close to cabins for convenience. Digging deeper required effort, and rocky soil made it difficult. Over time, pits filled and new ones were dug nearby. Rainwater washed waste into surrounding ground, sometimes seeping toward wells or streams. The connection between sanitation and water contamination was not always understood, so placement of outhouses often prioritized accessibility over safety. Flies gathered in large numbers around waste, then traveled freely to kitchens and dining areas. Their presence was constant. Families tried to reduce odors by covering pits with soil, but effectiveness was limited. Garbage from food preparation added to the problem. Vegetable peels, bones, and spoiled scraps were thrown outside, forming small piles. These attracted animals and insects. Dogs and pigs rummaged through refuse, scattering it further. During rain, the mixture turned into foul-smelling mud. Some communities eventually established designated dumping areas, but early settlers managed individually. The proximity of waste to living spaces increased exposure to bacteria. Even washing water contributed. After cleaning dishes or laundry, dirty water was often poured near the cabin. Soap residue mixed with food particles and dirt, creating damp patches. Flies and mosquitoes thrived in these moist environments. Children playing nearby came into contact with contaminated soil. Over time, the area around homes became a complex mix of organic waste. Attempts to maintain cleanliness were ongoing but imperfect. Some families burned garbage, reducing volume but producing smoke and ash. Others buried waste, though shallow burial allowed animals to dig it up. Each method offered partial solutions. The lack of organized sanitation systems meant that individual habits determined conditions. Variation between households existed, but overall, the environment remained challenging. Seasonal changes affected waste management. In winter, frozen ground slowed decomposition, reducing odors but making digging difficult. Waste accumulated until thaw, when melting snow spread contaminants. Spring rains washed material into water sources. Summer heat accelerated decay, intensifying smells and attracting insects. Autumn brought falling leaves that covered refuse temporarily, only for it to reappear later. Livestock contributed significantly. Animals produced manure that accumulated near barns or cabins. Some was used as fertilizer, but not all could be managed immediately. Piles attracted flies and added to the overall sanitation challenge. During rain, manure mixed with mud, and people tracked it indoors. The boundary between living space and waste blurred. Children and adults alike walked through contaminated ground daily. Illness often followed patterns linked to these conditions. Stomach ailments were common, and families recognized them as part of frontier life. They might attribute sickness to weather or fatigue rather than sanitation. Remedies included herbal teas, rest, and hope. Recovery varied. Severe outbreaks occasionally struck entire communities, highlighting the consequences of poor waste management. Despite these risks, settlers adapted. They developed routines for rotating food supplies, using older items first. They improved preservation techniques through experience. Some constructed root cellars partially underground, offering cooler storage. Others built smokehouses to process meat more efficiently. These improvements reduced spoilage but required time and resources. Not everyone achieved them. Community cooperation sometimes emerged. Neighbors shared salt or helped with large preservation tasks. Collective butchering allowed efficient use of animals. Shared knowledge spread better practices gradually. Still, isolation limited consistency. Each household faced its own challenges. The smell of waste and spoiled food became familiar. People grew accustomed to it, noticing it less over time. Visitors from more established areas often remarked on odors, but settlers focused on survival. The priority remained securing enough food and maintaining basic shelter. Cleanliness, while valued, competed with pressing needs. Children learned these realities early. They assisted with carrying scraps, feeding animals leftovers, and fetching water. Through participation, they absorbed the rhythm of frontier life. The cycle of cooking, eating, and disposing of waste repeated daily. Improvement came slowly. Over years, as settlements stabilized, some areas developed better sanitation. Wells were dug farther from outhouses, and designated waste pits were established. Yet the early frontier remained defined by improvisation. The combination of limited preservation, close proximity of waste, and constant exposure to insects created an environment where food safety was uncertain. Survival depended on resilience and tolerance. Meals, though sometimes risky, sustained families through demanding labor. Waste, though problematic, was managed as best as possible. The frontier demanded acceptance of imperfections. Clean, safe conditions were ideals rather than realities. Within this context, settlers carved out lives, balancing hunger, resourcefulness, and endurance in a world where even the simplest act of storing food carried hidden dangers. Medical care on the American frontier was scarce, inconsistent, and often improvised, leaving settlers to rely on limited knowledge and whatever remedies were available. Doctors were few and far between, and many communities went months or even years without seeing a trained physician. When illness or injury struck, families depended on home treatments, folk remedies, and practical guesswork. Knowledge passed from generation to generation guided their actions, but outcomes were unpredictable. Herbal mixtures made from local plants were common, brewed into teas or crushed into poultices. Some provided relief, while others had little effect or even caused harm. Alcohol served multiple purposes, used as a disinfectant, pain reliever, or calming agent, though its effectiveness was limited. Surgical procedures, when necessary, were performed under difficult conditions. Tools were reused repeatedly, wiped clean but rarely sterilized. The concept of germs was not widely understood, and infection frequently followed. A deep cut from chopping wood or a wound from handling animals could become swollen red and painful within days. Fever often followed, and without antibiotics, recovery depended largely on the body's strength. Minor injuries that would be easily treated today sometimes proved fatal. Burns from cooking fires, splinters from rough lumber, and broken bones from falls all carried risks. Setting a fracture required skill, and improper alignment could leave permanent disability. Bandages were made from cloth torn from clothing, washed when possible but not always thoroughly. These bandages absorbed fluids, and sometimes introduced contaminants. Even when healing began, re-injury was common, as daily work rarely paused for recovery. Illnesses unrelated to injury were equally challenging. Fever, coughs, and stomach ailments appeared frequently. Without diagnostic tools, settlers judged severity by symptoms alone. Some illnesses resolved naturally, while others worsened rapidly. Epidemics occasionally spread through settlements, affecting multiple households. Isolation was difficult, and care for the sick often exposed caregivers. Families attempted to separate the ill in corners of cabins, but space was limited. Bedding used by sick individuals was later reused, sometimes without thorough cleaning. Children were particularly vulnerable. Their immune systems were less developed, and they were more exposed to environmental hazards. Cuts from playing outdoors, infections from insect bites, and complications from common illnesses took a heavy toll. Parents did their best with available knowledge, but uncertainty remained constant. Pregnancy and childbirth presented additional dangers. Midwives or experienced neighbors assisted, using traditional practices. Most births occurred at home, with limited equipment. Complications such as prolonged labor or infection could be life-threatening. Without surgical options, outcomes depended on endurance and luck. Despite these risks, families continued to grow, and communities expanded. Travel added another layer of difficulty. Wagon trains moved slowly across rough terrain, and injuries occurred frequently. Wheels broke, animals bolted, and uneven ground caused falls. When accidents happened, treatment took place in makeshift camps. Supplies were limited, and cleanliness was difficult to maintain. Dust covered wounds, and water for washing was scarce. Travelers carried basic kits, including bandages and simple medicines, but these were quickly depleted. Heat and exhaustion compounded problems. Long days in the sun led to dehydration, dizziness, and weakness. Water sources along trails were not always safe, and drinking contaminated water worsened health. Rest stops provided temporary relief, but schedules often pushed groups onward. The smell of unwashed bodies, animals, and waste followed caravans. Garbage accumulated, and dead animals were sometimes left behind. These conditions attracted insects and spread disease. Campsites used by multiple groups became contaminated. Each new arrival added to the mixture of waste. Hygiene during travel was minimal, bathing was rare, and clothing remained unchanged for long periods. Dust-coated skin and sweat-intensified odors. Nights brought cooler air but also insects. Mosquito bites irritated skin and sometimes transmitted illness. Fires burned for cooking and warmth, adding smoke to the environment. Sleep was often interrupted by discomfort or worry. Even routine medical practices were challenging. Extracting a tooth, for example, required simple tools and courage. Pain relief was minimal and infection could follow. Bloodletting, still practiced in some areas, weakened patients further. Despite good intentions, treatments sometimes worsened conditions. Over time, settlers learned through experience, abandoning ineffective methods and adopting those that seemed helpful. Communication between communities spread knowledge slowly. A remedy that worked in one area might be tried in another. Success stories encouraged adoption while failures led to caution. Still, without scientific understanding, progress was gradual. Some individuals developed reputations as healers, relying on observation and practical skill. They traveled between settlements, offering assistance. Their presence was valued even if their methods varied. Supplies for medical care were limited. Cloth for bandages had to be washed and reused. Herbs depended on seasonal availability. Alcohol, though useful, was often reserved for other purposes. Families improvised constantly, using whatever materials they had. A splint might be fashioned from sticks and a sling from a scarf. Creativity filled gaps left by scarcity. Emotional strain accompanied physical challenges. Fear of illness or injury lingered, knowing help might not arrive. Families watched one another closely, recognizing early signs of trouble. Support networks formed, with neighbors assisting when possible. Shared labor allowed someone to rest, and shared knowledge improved outcomes. Despite hardship, cooperation strengthened communities. Travel hazards remained persistent. River crossings posed risks of drowning or losing supplies. Storms damaged wagons, scattering belongings. In such moments, injuries multiplied. Treating multiple patients at once stretched resources thin. Decisions about who needed immediate care were difficult. The journey itself tested resilience. Dust storms reduced visibility, and cold nights chilled bodies. Continuous movement limited opportunities for thorough cleaning. Over weeks, conditions deteriorated. Yet settlers pressed forward, driven by hope of reaching destinations. Upon arrival, recovery took time. Establishing homes required immediate labor, even for those still weak. Medical care remained limited, but stability improved chances. Over years, some communities attracted trained physicians. Their presence introduced new techniques, though supplies were still scarce. Gradual improvements emerged, but early frontier life remained defined by improvisation. The absence of reliable healthcare shaped attitudes. People valued strength and endurance. Minor ailments were endured without complaint, and only severe cases drew attention. This stoicism reflected necessity rather than indifference. Survival depended on continuing work despite discomfort. Infections, injuries, and exhaustion were part of daily life. Yet within these challenges, settlers displayed remarkable adaptability. They learned to recognize symptoms, prepare remedies, and support one another. Travel, though harsh, connected communities and spread ideas. Over time, knowledge accumulated, improving survival rates. Still, the frontier remained a place where even small injuries could escalate and where medical care, when available, was often uncertain. Children suffered the most on the American frontier, growing up in an environment where hardship was not an occasional challenge, but a constant presence woven into everyday life. From a very young age, they were exposed to the same unsanitary conditions as adults, yet their smaller bodies and developing immune systems made them far more vulnerable. Many went barefoot during warmer months, not out of choice but because shoes were expensive and quickly worn out. Bare feet stepped into mud, animal droppings, and dust mixed with waste, creating frequent opportunities for cuts, infections, and parasites. Even small scratches could become swollen and painful, and without proper cleaning or medical treatment. These minor injuries sometimes led to serious complications. Play, though essential for childhood, often took place in environments filled with hazards. Children climbed rough wooden fences, explored nearby streams, and wandered through fields where livestock grazed. They handled animals, gathered sticks, and helped with chores, constantly interacting with soil and organic matter. Their hands, rarely washed thoroughly, carried dirt to their faces and mouths. Stomach illnesses were common, and bouts of fever appeared frequently. Parents watched anxiously, aware that recovery was uncertain. Malnutrition added to their vulnerability. Frontier diets, though filling, lacked variety. Meals centered on salted meats, coarse bread, and whatever vegetables were available. Fresh fruit was seasonal, and dairy products spoiled quickly. Growing bodies required nutrients that were not always accessible. As a result, some children appeared thin and tired, their energy limited by diet. Work began early in life. By the time they could walk steadily, children were assigned simple tasks. They gathered eggs, fetched water in small buckets, and carried kindling. These chores taught responsibility but also exposed them to cold, heat, and strain. Long hours outdoors meant constant contact with insects. Mosquitoes, flies, and ticks irritated skin, and scratching sometimes led to infection. Clothing offered limited protection. Garments were practical but often worn repeatedly without washing. Fabric absorbed sweat and dirt, rubbing against skin and causing irritation. Lice and fleas found easy hosts among children, spreading quickly in crowded cabins. Nighttime brought little relief. Families slept close together, sharing blankets that harbored insects. Coughs and sneezes spread easily, and one child's illness often affected siblings. Medical care for children relied on home remedies. Herbal teas soothed symptoms, and rest was encouraged when possible. However, work rarely paused entirely. Older children continued chores even when not fully well, while younger ones remained near parents during daily activities. Accidents were common. Climbing trees, helping with tools, or assisting in animal care introduced risks. A fall from a fence, a kick from livestock, or a slip on muddy ground could result in broken bones or bruises. Without proper splints or rest, healing was uncertain. Some injuries left lasting effects, shaping the course of a child's life. Despite these challenges, childhood on the frontier also involved learning skills essential for survival. Children observed adults closely, absorbing knowledge about planting crops, preparing food, and maintaining shelters. They learned to identify useful plants and recognize dangerous conditions. This practical education prepared them for adulthood, but also meant early exposure to responsibility. Education in the formal sense was limited. Schools were rare, and distance made attendance difficult. When schools existed, they were small and operated irregularly. Many children learned basic reading and writing at home, but daily labor often took priority. Weather influenced routines. In summer, heat and insects increased discomfort. In winter, cold limited outdoor play, and children remained indoors, sharing confined space. Cabin life intensified exposure to smoke and odors. Yet families valued togetherness, and storytelling or simple games offered moments of comfort. Emotional resilience developed alongside physical endurance. Children adapted to uncertainty, understanding that illness, loss, and hardship were part of life. They formed strong bonds with siblings, sharing chores and experiences. Laughter still appeared even in difficult conditions, providing relief from monotony. Seasonal changes brought different challenges. Spring rains created muddy surroundings, and children slipped while carrying water or tending animals. Summer demanded long hours helping in fields, exposing them to sunburn and dehydration. Autumn involved harvesting, with heavy lifting and repetitive tasks. Winter introduced cold that numbed fingers and toes. Each season shaped routines and tested endurance. Clothing for children was often handed down from older siblings. Sizes rarely fit perfectly, and garments were patched repeatedly. Shoes, when available, were worn until they fell apart. Going barefoot became normal despite risks. Hygiene remained limited. Bathing occurred infrequently, and hair washing was rare. Dirt accumulated, and the smell of smoke clung to fabric. Yet within communities, this appearance was common and accepted. Social interactions among children reflected shared circumstances. They played together, helped each other with chores, and formed friendships based on cooperation. Isolation between settlements meant fewer companions, but when opportunities arose, children valued them. Community gatherings, such as religious meetings or seasonal events, allowed them to interact. These occasions often involved extra effort to wash and wear clear clothing, creating brief contrasts to daily life. Mortality rates among frontier children were high. Disease, accidents, and malnutrition contributed to loss. Families mourned but continued, driven by necessity. Surviving children grew up quickly, stepping into roles left vacant. This reality shaped attitudes toward resilience and responsibility. Despite hardship, hope persisted. Parents envisioned better conditions for their children, working to improve homes and establish communities. Over time, some settlements developed schools, cleaner water sources, and improved sanitation. Children born later benefited from these changes. Yet early frontier childhood remained defined by exposure to harsh environments and limited resources. Still, many children adapted remarkably. They developed strength, independence, and practical knowledge. They learned to navigate uncertain conditions and support one another. Their experiences, though difficult, contributed to the growth of frontier communities. Life expectancy remained lower than modern standards, but survival stories highlighted determination. Children who reached adulthood carried memories of hardship that shaped their outlook. They understood the value of small comforts and the importance of cooperation. The frontier demanded resilience from its youngest members, and they responded with adaptability. Their daily lives reflected the broader reality of frontier existence, where survival depended on endurance, resourcefulness, and hope for improvement. Life on the frontier was never truly separate from danger, and as families worked tirelessly to survive, they constantly faced threats that went beyond disease, filth, and hunger. The land itself was both a provider and a predator, offering the resources needed for life while harboring hidden hazards that could claim it in an instant. Wolves, bears, and other predators roamed the wilderness, drawn by the scent of livestock or the presence of humans, and encounters were a terrifying reality for settlers who often had little more than a rifle or a pitchfork to defend themselves. Even smaller creatures carried risks. Venomous snakes, ticks, and biting insects were constant companions, often unnoticed until their effects were painfully felt. Frontier children learned quickly to recognize danger in the natural world, yet accidents were inevitable, and adults were constantly vigilant while performing chores such as chopping wood, tending animals, or crossing streams. Every step outdoors held uncertainty, from loose rocks on hillsides to hidden holes in fields. The land that seemed open and inviting at sunrise could transform in an instant under storm clouds or shifting weather patterns. Sudden thunderstorms drenched travelers, soaked crops, and turned paths into slick, impassable mud, and lightning struck with unpredictable ferocity, igniting dry fields or cabins. Rivers that appeared shallow could become raging torrents after rain, sweeping away bridges, livestock, and even people who misjudged their depth or current. In winter, the landscape changed again, snow and ice bringing beauty but also paralysis. Frozen ground made digging or farming impossible, and deep snow blocked trails, isolating families from neighbors for days or weeks. Frostbite and hypothermia were constant threats, especially to children or those ill prepared for the cold. Fires offered warmth and comfort, but they were imperfect shields. Chimneys clogged with soot, and sparks could ignite thatched roofs or dry wooden walls. Families slept with a wary ear for crackling sounds or sudden smoke, knowing a single spark could destroy everything they had built. Cooking fires, necessary for survival, were also a hazard. While preparing meals, hot pots and open flames burned hands and clothes. Oil lamps and candles added light but increased risk. Tipping over a lamp in the middle of the night could start a blaze that spread quickly. Tools themselves were dangerous. Axes, knives, and saws were essential for building and chopping, yet each carried the potential for serious injury. One careless swing could result in deep cuts or loss of a finger. Even routine tasks like hammering nails or splitting firewood required constant attention. Accidents were amplified by the lack of immediate medical care. Infections followed minor wounds, and a simple accident could become life-threatening. Settlers adapted by training themselves and their children to respect tools and anticipate risk. Hunting and gathering were necessary for survival but came with their own dangers. Tracking game through dense forests or across rough terrain exposed hunters to hidden cliffs, poison ivy, or sudden encounters with wild animals. Traps, snares, and homemade weapons could injure both intended prey and humans if handled carelessly. In winter, hunting became even more hazardous. Snow-covered familiar tracks made rivers treacherous and masked hidden ice patches. Cold and exhaustion compounded every risk, yet families relied on hunting to supplement meager supplies. Travel between settlements amplified these hazards. Wagon trains creaked along rough, uneven trails, with horses pulling heavy loads through mud, across streams, and over rocky hills. Broken wheels, lost animals, and overturned carts were common. Travelers carried basic supplies for emergencies, but injuries during the journey often required ingenuity to survive. Isolation meant that help could be days or weeks away. Those who became ill while traveling faced dehydration, exposure, and the compounded risks of inadequate nutrition. In addition to natural hazards, settlers faced threats from other humans. Bandits, thieves, or hostile groups occasionally targeted remote homesteads, exploiting isolation. Settlers developed strategies to protect their property and families, reinforcing cabins, keeping weapons close, and traveling in groups whenever possible. Vigilance became part of daily life, and even children were taught to recognize strangers and sound alarms if danger approached. Social tension within frontier communities also posed challenges. Scarce resources and long winters bred conflict over land, water rights, or grazing territory. Disputes could escalate quickly, and without legal authorities nearby, settlers often resolved conflicts themselves, sometimes with violence. Despite these constant threats, people found ways to endure. They established routines, relied on cooperation with neighbors, and created systems for early warning. Bell systems, watch shifts, and communication by signal fires or flags helped mitigate risk. However, uncertainty remained a permanent companion, shaping daily habits and long-term decisions. Nutrition influenced survival and resilience. While salted meat, dried grains, and root vegetables were staples, shortages were common. Families cultivated small gardens, preserved what they could, and supplemented rations with foraged fruits, nuts, and wild greens. Weather, pests, and soil quality limited yields. A poor harvest could mean hunger or malnutrition, weakening bodies and making illness more likely. Children's growth and energy were particularly affected, and adults faced the dual burden of laboring while conserving enough for young ones. Water safety remained another pervasive concern. Streams that provided drinking water could also harbor parasites, bacteria, and other contaminants. Settlers filtered or boiled water when possible, but shortages sometimes forced consumption of unsafe sources. Illnesses such as dysentery and typhoid fever were frequent. Families had to identify symptoms quickly, isolate the sick when possible, and rely on limited remedies to avoid widespread contagion. Winter compounded water challenges. Rivers froze, wells could freeze partially, and hauling water became a physically exhausting task. Settlers carried heavy pails over snow and ice, exposing themselves to slips, frostbite, and exhaustion. At the same time, indoor smoke from fires added to respiratory strain. Ventilation was limited to conserve heat, yet smoke inhalation became a daily hazard, irritating eyes, throats, and lungs. Indoor air combined with dust, animal dander, and cooking odors to create a constantly challenging environment. Livestock, while essential for meat, milk, and labor, introduced additional hardships. Animals tracked mud into cabins, carried parasites, and sometimes transmitted disease. Families often sheltered animals indoors during extreme weather, further contaminating living spaces. Managing animals required skill, time, and constant attention. Daily labor dominated life. From sunrise to sunset, settlers worked fields, tended animals, repaired tools, chopped wood, and gathered fuel. Even when not in the fields, tasks continued inside cabins: cooking, cleaning, mending clothing, and maintaining shelters. Labor was relentless, and fatigue was constant. Rest was often brief and interrupted by children, animals, or emergencies. Sleep occurred on rough bedding with limited insulation, and often in close proximity to livestock. Nighttime brought cold, insects, and the worry of predators. Despite these conditions, community bonds offered relief. Neighbors helped each other during planting and harvest, shared firewood, and warned of dangers. Community gatherings, though infrequent, provided emotional respite and practical advice. Knowledge exchange was critical for survival, especially in learning to handle medical issues, preserve food, or manage livestock. Children absorbed these lessons alongside practical work. By the time they were 10 or 12, they could perform many essential tasks with skill, carrying the knowledge forward to adulthood. Education was often informal, learned through observation and participation rather than school. Stories, songs, and oral tradition passed wisdom about survival, dangerous areas, and seasonal patterns. Even games taught caution, agility, and resourcefulness. Illness remained a constant concern. Simple fevers could turn deadly, and epidemics sometimes swept through settlements, killing quickly and unpredictably. Medical supplies were minimal: herbs, alcohol, and rudimentary instruments. Families improvised, relying on observation and trial-and-error remedies. Pain, infection, and death were familiar realities. Emotional resilience developed alongside physical endurance. Settlers became accustomed to hardship, accepting it as a permanent feature of life. Optimism existed, but it was tempered by realism. Planning for the future required careful attention to resources, weather, and potential threats. Decisions carried consequences for survival, and miscalculations could be catastrophic. Winter storms isolated settlements, damaged buildings, and threatened food stores. Summer heat and drought stressed crops and livestock. Rainfall could be both blessing and curse, bringing water to crops but flooding homes and contaminating water supplies. Families adapted by storing surplus, reinforcing shelters, and developing contingency plans, yet unpredictability remained. Life expectancy on the frontier was lower than in established cities. Adults faced daily hazards, and children were especially vulnerable. Families endured loss regularly, yet they continued to build homes, cultivate land, and raise children. Human determination coexisted with constant awareness of mortality. Despite these relentless challenges, communities gradually expanded. Settlements grew, infrastructure improved, and knowledge accumulated. Wells were dug deeper, cabins reinforced, and medical understanding slowly advanced. Over time, conditions became more manageable, but early frontier life was characterized by exposure to danger, filth, disease, and the raw unpredictability of nature. Settlers developed practical skills, emotional resilience, and communal bonds, creating the foundations for future generations. Survival depended on vigilance, labor, and cooperation, and even the smallest improvements in hygiene, shelter, or nutrition could make a critical difference. Yet no matter how prepared, each day required adaptation. The frontier demanded constant attention, unrelenting effort, and acceptance of conditions that modern observers would find unbearable. People endured, thrived in some areas, and perished in others, their lives a testament to human resilience in the face of the raw, unfiltered reality of early American frontier existence. Families built communities despite constant threats, teaching children survival skills, maintaining homes with ingenuity, and adapting to a world where the environment, disease, and human error were ever-present challenges. Over generations, these experiences shaped attitudes, skills, and expectations, leaving a legacy of toughness, resourcefulness, and courage. Those who survived learned to read the land, anticipate dangers, and work in harmony with both nature and neighbors. They understood the delicate balance between risk and reward, realizing that life was both precious and precarious. The frontier tested every aspect of human capability, from physical strength and endurance to emotional resilience and ingenuity. Every day was a negotiation with the elements, animals, illness, and scarcity. Families who adapted thrived, those who faltered faced harsh consequences. The frontier was not simply a place, it was a crucible, forging generations capable of surviving in conditions that demanded constant alertness, practical knowledge, and unwavering determination. Through these challenges, settlers built the foundations of future towns, farms, and communities, transforming raw wilderness into spaces of human habitation, while never forgetting the raw dangers and relentless labor that characterized life on the edge of civilization.